فاتبع سببا حتى إذا بلغ مغرب الشمس وجدها تغرب في عين حمئة ووجد عندها قوما.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Now, as I've shown previously, the early commentators concentrated on speaking about the spring and not the sun setting in the spring. Actually, they don't mention this. So you can examine those tafsirs and find out for yourself. Now, what I want to speak about in this lesson is regarding the nature of the spring, which is what actually the commentators in the past spoke about. They mentioned two different qualities of this spring, which were that it was black or dark, and the other one, hot. Both of those descriptions for the spring have to do with the different recitations that have reached us from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in an unbroken chain. And they are Aynin Hamiyatin and Aynin Hami'atin. So the second one is actually the one used in the qira'ah of Hafs and Asim, which is the most famous one today. So Aynin Hami'atin. We also have Aynin Hamiyah. Allah intended both of these meanings in the ayah. So Aynin Hamiyah means a hot spring, like this one here. And we have Aynin Hami'atin, which means a black spring or a muddy spring. Now, I'm going to be presenting from a famous tafsir, which was written last century, Tahreer wa Tanweer by Sheikh Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashoor, rahimahullah. Now, what he's done is he's taken opinions from scholars of the past and he's added his own commentary to the ayat. And what he says is the following. It's regarding the ayn that Dhul Qarnain saw. He says, وَيَظْهَرُ أَنَّ هَذِهِ الْعَيْنِ مِنْ عُيُونَ النَّفْطِ. And it's apparent, so it's quite apparent to him that this spring is from the springs of a naft. A naft actually is petroleum, or in America they call it oil. The spring, al-waqi'atu ala sahili bahri al-khazr. Another name for it is Qazwin, which is the Caspian Sea. So he's saying that it's apparent that it's from the springs of petroleum, the one that is present on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Haythu Madinatu Baku. In the vicinity of the city of Baku. In English it's Baku, B-A-K-U. And it says here, وَفِيهَا مَنَابِعَ النَّفْطِ الْآن. In it now are oil wells. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ مَعْرُوفًا يَوْمَئِذٍ. And this was not known in the time of Dhul Qarnain. So what he's saying actually is that this is actually a prophecy. What he saw was a well that had petroleum mixed in it. And this was giving the blackness of the ayn. What happens actually naturally, there's actually a phenomenon known as a petroleum seep. And this explains how petroleum can come to the surface naturally. And it says here, petroleum seeps are quite common in many areas of the world. And that's obviously the ones that are rich in oil. Now, this is actually the area that he was speaking about, Baku. And that's the Caspian Sea there. And this is actually an area with a large oil industry. Now, let's actually look at a satellite view of this. And that's the area here that Ibn Ashoor was speaking about. Another point is there's actually volcanic activity in this area. And there are a lot of hot springs as well. What he might have seen was a hot spring that had a petroleum seep. And that matches perfectly with the ayah, with both of the recitations, Hamiyah and Hami'ah. Now, a few questions. Now, if you want to mention this fact in the Quran, which surah would be the surah that you would mention it in? The one that would be most relevant. This story is mentioned in the surah of the Quran, which the Prophet ﷺ asked us to recite each week on Friday. So there's relevance to us. And also, it is a protection from the trials of the Dajjal at the end of time. So, the most relevant surah where petroleum would be mentioned is Surah Al-Kahf, and that's where it's mentioned. Second question. If petroleum is mentioned, it's mentioned in a way that somebody saw it. Which personality in the Quran, prophets, righteous people, whoever it is, which one would have been the best person to observe it and for it to be relevant to him? In my opinion, it's Dhul Qarnain. And the reason why I say this is because Dhul Qarnain was a world leader and the superpower of his time. Petroleum and world power are connected as we see today. There are wars going on today because of petroleum. And so the fact that Dhul Qarnain saw this spring is quite remarkable. He saw something which was going to become the product or the thing that is most sought after in order to become a superpower. That's very interesting. And some other points about this. The ayah talks about him discovering the spring as the sun set. Now it's interesting because when we talk about time, the time that mankind has been on this earth, we can describe it as a day. Now, sunset actually is a metaphor for the end of time. And it's very interesting that he actually saw this spring at that point. And at the end of the day, we say Allahu Alam, but it is quite remarkable, all those connections. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله